Speak for itself. Something awesome about documentary. We get to create our own context within this 90-minute film, and I think the real special thing about tonight is that you are really one of the first audiences to see this movie. Magnolia Pictures is releasing it in theaters starting March 29th, so afterwards you can continue the conversation and tell people that they will have a chance to see it soon. But we debuted at Sundance, and that's been our trajectory. It's very up to the moment. The film ends with the midterms. And I think the other thing that's special about tonight is that I hope you stay for the conversation. We're gonna have a great panel afterwards. So a big thanks to New America, to BetaWorks, to Beth, and Magnolia Pictures, and please enjoy the film.
I'm Andrew Morantz from the New Yorker. I'm moderating.
I'm Alison Klayman. Hi again. Thanks for watching. I spent 13 months with Steve Bannon and shot and directed this one.
We're so sorry.
Someone's got to do it.
My name is Paul Lewis. I'm from The Guardian.
Star of the show, Joan Walsh from The Nation.
Therese, Guirgis, I produced the film.
So there's so much we could be talking about, but I think I want to start with some things that show up in the film. I mean, this is a film about lots of things: populism, racism, Europe, America. It's also a film about journalism, and I want to talk, since we have Paul and since Alison's here, and everybody else can weigh in too. You see a lot of people doing what is called access journalism in the film. You see a lot of people hanging around. You see a lot of people. Paul in one scene says, like, smirking uncomfortably or something. There's a lot of that in the film. And so I wanted to ask you guys how, I mean, you can tell the way that the audience is responding to it. They want more of what Paul's doing, and they want less of what all the other journalists in the film are doing. And so the question, I guess, is, given that journalists need access to be around powerful people, and given that there's this whole, perhaps outmoded, we can discuss, you know, idea of journalistic objectivity, how do you negotiate in your careers and in your thinking on this, those two poles of being, you know, nice to the person in the room so they don't throw you out, with having sort of serving your ethical role as a journalist?
That's for me, both of us. Well, it's a good question, and it's a difficult question to answer, because in defense of any journalists who came across as if they were sort of somehow too cozy with Bannon, you know, it's a requirement of access journalism that, and many of them were doing access journalism because they're political reporters, they cover the White House. Bannon is one of their sources, to be nice to people and to keep them on side. And I guess I was in a slightly different position, and that I had a different approach, because you know, I don't cover the White House. I used to be Washington correspondent a couple of years ago, but I now work in London, and I was really interested in following what Bannon was doing and trying to sort of sift fact from fiction. So I had less of a sort of stake in befriending him. I would say one thing, and Alison should talk more, because she's been witnessing the sort of carousel of people come past through Bannon's orbit. One thing I always noticed was just how incredibly charming and disarming he is with people, including journalists. He's very tactile, touches you a lot, actually. And he just has a way of making you feel like you're in with the joke, and it's all okay. And actually that pissed me off. And I think you can see as I was walking out the room, he was sort of doing that. You don't really believe in that anti-Semitism, dog whistle stuff. And actually, I think he knows exactly what he's doing when he leverages those kinds of tropes. And so I felt it was okay to say it.
Yeah, and just to stick on that moment for a second, that was a very interesting moment, because your camera was off, right? So you were just sort of saying that to him in a sincere way. I mean, were you saying that because you just felt, because Alison's cameras were there, or because you just, in the moment, felt that was... I mean, I asked not only because of that moment, but because, to me, that was a stand-in for... There are plenty of journalists who are very good at their job who would let something like that pass, because why jump in when you don't have to?
I don't really know how to answer that question other than I think if you're not faithful to how you really believe the world is, then what's the sort of point? And the other thing, just very quickly, Alison, you say were you aware of her camera? She is a brilliant filmmaker. Many of you will have seen her previous film about Ai Weiwei. She just blends into the background. I forgot Alison was there. I met Bannon 6 or 7 times around Europe, and every time I forgot Alison was there. So that was sort of to her credit that she managed to pull that off.
Yeah, this is the unnatural stage of filmmaking process for me when I'm like, when people are supposed to look at me. But yeah, I mean, these questions are all in the soup of what I was thinking about a lot while making this film, and definitely I was there with a different objective, probably similar to how Paul described his, but even longer. I'm also independent, so I'm not, I follow journalistic standards, but I don't represent, a publication.
I'm a journalist.
Yeah, I am not a journalist, and I think documentary kind of has a privileged position because you can, like I said at the beginning, set your own context, your own context for your own work. Like, this is a freestanding work. And for me, I mean, the way I navigated the daily activities, like I did have some rules for myself, but they came very naturally. Like, I think probably holding my tongue was the main thing. Also, I was trying to be observational. The point of the movie was not going to be like, my travels with Bannon, even though in effect, this film is the distillation of my experience of what I observed since I filmed it and then also put it together. But my professional persona was, I wasn't there under a fake premise, and he knew what my politics were, but I tried to talk about my politics as little as possible, because what did I really have to gain from that? I just wanted him to talk. But I never laughed at things that I didn't think were funny. I really related to Paul when he said that. I mean, for me, that's just, because I wasn't there as a fake me, I was just there as my job wasn't to speak out at every instance, my job was to keep asking questions or to say, just, can I be in the room? Can I be there? That sounds interesting. Can I film that? And so, I acted interested in everything, but I never laughed if I didn't think something was funny. And, I think only when we did talk, I, would say what I thought. But that also extended to his whole world too. So I definitely spent time off camera where, I probably listened to a lot of conversations that if I was just there not on the job, I might have things to say, but I just kind of held my tongue. That was kind of the line that I walked.
Joan, do you have thoughts of, you had a piece, I believe, today about a wonderful run-in you had with Tucker Carlson. You had lots of occasions to deal with this sort of quasi-ethical, quasi-journalistic dilemma. When you were watching this, did you have any sort of thoughts as a journalist?
No, I really was very proud of Paul, and I know how hard that is to do, because we are trying to get the story, keep the access, and I will, thanks to you, not judge any of the people that I saw there. I thought it was so interesting that Michael Wolff is still in the background, even though he wrote that book that got him in so much trouble. So it's, for a lot of people, it really is a game, and it really is kind of disgusting. But this is what, this is what he thrives on. I know him slightly, and he was always telling me that the nation's audience would really like his ideas, and the Bernie Sanders voters were going to come over. But the core of his ideas is racism, whether he wants to admit that or not. And he's got Jewish friends. He will tell you he's not anti-Semitic, but he is powered by anti-Semitism. And the idea that he would say, I wrote it down, but I didn't bring my notebook up, pipe bombs are the cost of admission to the arena? Is that what he said?
That's his quote in the New York Times.
Okay, I missed that in the New York Times. I mean, it's bad. It's pretty bad, but I value what you guys did, not, to show us all of this and not just judge and walk out.
Yeah, and I think also the question of, because now it's talked about a lot, you know, the question of platforming and how, you know, should you cover these people, but it's really, or these people promoting these ideas, but it's really about how, right? I mean, to me, it's not to us to say, you know, do we or don't we, but it's more like how, and I think you have to be motivated and fueled by the right questions and not just, and again, there are some people, it is their job in some ways that they're just reporting the daily news of it, but I still think even in that you can bring intention to, you know, is the question what lies in someone's heart, or is the question who is funding them? You know, is the question what policies are they advocating? You know, I think there's like other questions you can ask while you're covering what, you know, people who are doing, you know, newsworthy things.
Yeah, and you can also choose to show the empty seats in the back of a sad meeting hall.
That was interesting.
I mean, there are lots of moves you can. I think this film is full of moves like that. That, you know, those are all choices that I think Steve Bannon understands as well as anyone. You know, what would Lenny Riefenstahl do? So I mean, the other thing though, the kind of other side of that coin is there's kind of a chilling moment where he says, I'm going to convert 20% of your people. I'm going to, you know, no matter, and he says, you know, the nation's people should be amenable to my economic nationalism or whatever. Some of that is just, you know, trash talk and, you know, rhetoric. But I think he does believe that, and I have talked to other, you know, far-right people who I think do believe that because they are, you know, they sort of have no choice but to go through the quote-unquote opposition party. So how does that enter into the calculus? You know, how do we think about, because I agree with Alison that you can't make it such a simple dichotomy of either you do or don't cover bad people. It's all in how you do it. That said, there are opportunity costs to everything, and exposing certain ideas to people who may or may not be swayed by them. You know, once you let something out in the world, he can make a propaganda film and then people can react to it by saying, I loved how non-propaganda it was. You can't control how people receive the ideas, even if you are careful about the tone with which you put them out. So how do you?
Well, I just think, you know, if you notice, I think in the film, Alison was very careful. If you actually watch it again, we don't actually hear much of his policy proposals or his stump speech, which, you know, is very repetitive, and we could both probably recite it. We could all probably recite it by heart, but, you know, I think there was a careful choice because this was a big conversation, and we did not undertake this film lightly.
I was going to say, I think some of the answer to that question can be contained in what I'm sure everyone would love to hear about, like how this project started and why, you know, because this was Marie Therese's idea to begin with, and I think the answer to that question is like contained in that idea.
Yeah, I think, you know, we would not have wanted to make a film if we thought that it could, you know, in any very legitimate way help him or convert people. I mean, he might like to say that, but that is not the case. I think that's not true of the film, but I think there were conscious choices. But yes, I many years ago I worked at a company that Steve Bannon bought with other people's money, and he became my boss, and he was my direct boss for several years. And then I had a pretty good relationship with him. I mean, he was a horrible boss, but it was also, you know, it's a long story. Actually, I have a coworker. I don't know if she's still here, but I have another former survivor in the back. But anyway, I stayed in touch with him for a few years, and then lost touch with him. And, you know, especially as his politics became increasingly far right. When I knew him, he was what I would consider sort of a moderate Republican, John McCain Republican, and then they just became increasingly extreme. But then he joined the Trump campaign, and I felt very strongly about that. I was very upset about it, and I had his contact information, and I just started sending him what were really actually quite nasty, vicious emails and text messages, because it's a strange thing to have this access to some, you know, and to my surprise, he actually would write back, and he was never nasty or vicious in return, and he was pretty friendly. And there's only so much catharsis that you can have from telling someone off, you know. And then I started feeling actually that's irresponsible. I might be able to do something more than just tell him off for my own sake. Should I become a spy? What should I do? And but I work in documentary, and one of the things that really hit me was that I was watching him suddenly. It's a strange thing to watch someone you knew who was not ever in the public eye suddenly just be everywhere. you couldn't walk down the street if you remember. There was a time where he was just everywhere, and I felt, knowing him, that he was being really given, not necessarily intentionally, but a lot of power, not just because he was covered everywhere, but the way he was being depicted was, evil genius, Darth Vader, mastermind, Trump's brain. Without him, there would be no victory. And it was all dark, and genius and powerful. And that's very powerful. It might not be nice to be called evil, but it's actually a very powerful thing. And knowing him the way I did, I knew that not only would he love that, but he was also probably gaining strength from it and gaining courage from it. And it was actually then becoming the currency that he was using, whether it's to go to Europe, whether it's to get people's money here and there. And it really drove me crazy because I felt that it was a somewhat false portrait of him. And I think he's much closer to the person you see here. And the other thing is you never heard about, his charisma, his charm. He was depicted as a Grim Reaper. And the fact is, his charm and his charisma, which are real, are a source of his power. They are they are also capital. That's how he gets so buddy-buddy with reporters and seduces people in this way. And I thought that it was important that people know that and know also that, everyone wants to think of him as this, ugly, blotchy-skinned, dark, horrible person. And I think people want to do that because I think it's actually comforting to think in a strange way that someone is just all horrible and dark and evil and ugly. But actually, what if someone is, funny sometimes and charismatic, and you might like having a beer with them, but then they also have these hateful, these hateful ideas and do this hateful work. Like, I think that's actually scarier to contemplate because that means that there could be many more of them. And that was really sort of the driving force for me, or the guy behind the idea. And then I just got extremely lucky that Alison came on board and she made the film that she made, which is hers.
And listening to you talk also, it's funny because none of that was discussed, or not none, but that was not the initial conversation. She really, wasn't saying, here's my vision of him, can you make a movie like that? I think I went in and, I was ready to make the movie about the person I found. If he really was the, intellectual, engine of some movement, okay, that's what this movie's about. But as, if he's really horrible, then that's what, interpersonally, that's what you will see in the movie. I mean, I had a pretty open mind, not really, in a sense, politically, because I have my own political viewpoint, and I make the movie as an artist with a political viewpoint. But I didn't have preconceived notions about him because I didn't know him personally. So, as the portrait came together, it was lucky that it looked the way that, you kind of saw it as well. I mean, I really think that this was a project, as verite documentary filmmaking should be, where, he is revealing himself. And then the story is crafted by a filmmaker with a particular, position in the world.
Well, I mean, you might not find him a towering intellect, but he did draw a triangle with Turkey and China, so I think can't argue with that.
The axis.
The axis. Do you, I would like to hear a lot more details about your story. I'm not gonna ask you for them all now, but like, the fact that you went from writing him vicious emails to saying, hey, do you want to be in a movie? And it worked. And we see that happening in the film too, right? You see people having these, I mean, Paul, that confrontation that you had was not the last time you spoke with him. So in all these cases, like, how does that work? Is it just water off a duck's back because he's saving Western civilization and he doesn't care? Or is it like, because I think for people who haven't been in the room in this kind of a situation, it seems weird that wouldn't be, that you would just be able to text that person an hour later. Yeah.
I would say though that I was like terrified. When we first met and Marie-Therese in person was speaking like, these texts and emails, I was like horrified. I was like, oh my God, you're gonna blow this. We haven't even started. Like, you're saying these things. I mean, I was really trying. And occasionally she'd be like, don't you think, Alison? And I was like, don't ask me my opinion, because I'm really there to try to be a blank slate, So she was really
with him in the room?
With him in the room, yeah. She was really quite...
Like what kind of stuff? Like political stuff, or
Yeah,
just like
political
you're an
stuff.
asshole, or just
Yeah, all of
Yeah.
that. I think I
Could you give us a
told him on
verbatim,
that he was
maybe?
going to hell.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, a lot of political, but also actually getting into political discussions and
Yeah.
arguments.
But it made me feel so comfortable because I felt like what a great luxury to be able to do this project and not in total, I mean, not total, but basically total transparency, certainly ideologically. There was no deception about who we were and what we wanted to do, so.
I think everyone else should weigh in. I think the one thing I can say, to be a little more personal about him, is I do think that he, I think he wants to be liked and approved by people like Paul and Joan and even me. And now, he is, there's a side of him that is actually, an intellectual snob that is very cultured, pretty sophisticated, despite his kind of like, aw shucks, thing, which is also fairly real too. And I think that it's very exciting for him to have The Guardian pay attention to him and Joan, and there's something, so I do think that there is like that attention. I mean, otherwise he's just in a little echo chamber of people who, and it might just be the people around him, but these aren't like, it's not like a brain trust around him,
No, you guys made that very clear.
I mean, there's a couple, I don't mean to say that about every person, it's not true, there obviously are a couple, but I'm just saying generally speaking, he's not in a think tank, okay? He's not going to a think tank every day discussing, so I do think that part of it is that he genuinely is like excited that people like this want to, but there's also more, potentially devious reasons, you could probably talk to those. Paul, why do you think he would still talk to you after
Were you constantly worried? I mean, you were worried that if you go hard, maybe you can't film again, and then that didn't quite happen, right?
No, in fact, it was quite strange because it was almost like the more I pushed him and the tougher I was with him, the more he sort of wanted us to come back and spend more time with him. And we were always, I was doing a separate thing for The Guardian. My first sort of appearance in the film was in London, and he was sort of asked me to sign a book. I don't know if you remember that, but it was at that meeting.
He does often.
He does. I mean, and it was at that meeting that he said, "Look, I'm doing this big project in Europe. We're gonna sort of unite Europe's far right, and it's going to be a currently secret campaign. I'm going to fund it, and I want The Guardian to have the exclusive." So that's what that meeting was about. And back to the discussion about how you cover people like this, I had to think about that, and I decided, you know what? No, we don't want that story because actually there's nothing there. It's just an idea. He had not recruited anybody. The whole plan was sort of riddled with flaws. So I just said, okay, instead we'll spend 4 months following you around, and we'll do our own sort of piece of journalism around it. And the conclusion of that was that actually this whole operation in Europe was unlawful. So campaign finance laws in all of these countries prevent a foreigner from doing things like funding social media or doing polling in your country. The same way as a Russian can't interfere in a US election.
They did.
I think that's the case. Shouldn't.
Mustn't, but-
Similar campaign finance laws in most European countries. And so this whole thing, you saw them going through that website. This is the homepage. There is no website. There are no members of the movement. The only thing was this thing they got with Salvini. There's a small far-right party in Spain called Vox, and that's it. I mean, there is, but nonetheless, he managed to ride the wave, even though it was an empty vessel. I'm mixing my metaphors, but he managed to ride that and get all of that attention. And actually, if you just sort of prod, there's nothing there. And I think he sort of did the same thing with the Trump at War film. It was a mechanism to attract attention, and he is brilliant. I mean, this is someone who made films in Hollywood. He ran Breitbart. He was instrumental in the founding of Cambridge Analytica. He's nothing if not a media executive. He understands media in a way that few other people do, and I think that's where his real power lies.
Yeah, I think you see that for sure. I guess, there's the question of when to let go of, when can we sort of feel safe that we don't have to worry about these people anymore? That's kind of the thing that hangs over, yeah. So, and I think that is the answer, but I think the question that, this is sort of like a fall, you see the word fall many times, there's kind of like a fall narrative, and so I guess the question that arises in the mind of a viewer is like, okay, when do we get to just say, okay, the bad dream is over and we get to go back to, and so I think the answer is never, but I mean, I guess the question is, how does that inform the work we do? How do we, and specifically, when do we acknowledge the Bannonian notion of the media being the opposition party, and when do we fight against that? Because to me, if the idea is that is that I'm a member of the opposition party to fascism, I'm like, cool, I'm fine being the opposition to that. So I don't see that, so it's a tricky double-edged sword.
Well, I think that informed, this is like a constant conversation in the edit room, and I edited this along with 2 editors, and we were often working in parts, and kind of every part was touched by all of us, but the overall narrative in terms of the decisions, especially for instance at the end, right, goes to that question. When it turned out that he did lose the house, and we had the idea going off of his line of this town's going to be very different, and using this motif we had of seeing around DC and how you hear news voices underneath, hearing the voices of the new members of Congress who were sort of outside of this silo of opinion, and they actually, we chose those lines very purposefully, not just to stir emotion, but actually in a way we were like, we don't want just like words, we want to see that these are people who have policy ideas that are for something, and actually, they might even be addressing some of the problems that Bannon also correctly identifies in society, but they have answers for them, and none of their answers are a wall, like there's real things that are intended to help the citizenry of the country, and we made that choice, but you couldn't end there, and we never would have considered ending there, because then that would be like, woohoo, what does that mean? It's the story's done, and similarly, I didn't think we could just end with him in the car being like, I'm gonna, I'll be back kind of a thing. You kind of needed that two-handed, because of the way this year played out, which I didn't know until it all happened, but like the editing, so much of it was walking a fine line, was juxtaposition, and was kind of doing this two-handed play, because I think it's too simplistic to say, watch out, but it's also too simplistic to say, don't worry, you know what I mean? And so I think we are constantly trying, and the same, we had that problem, as we were dealing with how to tell the story of the whole Europe section of the film, because how do we convey, especially when we think of an American audience who might not know as well as a European audience about the success that some of these parties have been having, not necessarily because of Bannon. So you kind of have to tell that story and feel the urgency. You have to see the things he is doing. Those people wouldn't have sat in that room and had that dinner and had that conversation, and necessarily without him kind of being there. But what is it really? And for us, I thought it was a great solution to pair that with going off of we're going to use the media, because it's a reminder that this story isn't just. It's never just that simple. So I don't know, I feel like it's always like both things, and that's probably also the kind of filmmaking I would prefer to do.
We are going to go to questions pretty soon, so just think they have to be the best questions. Only the best, because we have only time for 3.
Do you want to say anything about your own work too? Because Andrew's here as a moderator, but also his work is pretty integral to all of these questions.
I was thinking a lot about it. So I cover, I don't like putting things on a linear spectrum, but if we were to do it on a flat spectrum, I cover people who are to the right of Bannon, who do exist. But I also, I cover that whole kind of populist sphere of stuff, and I think about this stuff all the time, because there's the question of hanging out until you have them hang themselves with their own rope, and then there's also the question of being in the audience. I felt the satisfaction of nailing down an incontrovertible fact. Like, I don't know why people keep talking about fascism, and then Paul says, well, this guy said, I love fascism. Like, that's a very, very satisfying, you can feel the relief of tension in the audience when that happens. I think the part that's harder for the kind of, I think the kind of work I do is closer to the kind of work that you do, where you're more just hanging around until you get a fuller picture, and it's rare that you get to hang someone on a
on a fact, like you got this fact wrong, and that's where I see more of a vulnerability for society in, not everything that Steve Bannon says is factually wrong. A lot of what he says is just his interpretation of the world, which I think is ethically wrong in many ways, or just worrisome in many ways. But so I guess that, and if anyone on the panel has thoughts about this, that's where I wonder about more vulnerability. I think I have faith in journalists, as long as they are properly funded and fed and have healthcare, to get to the bottom of factual. I mean, it's very, very hard work, and it needs more and more. It's more and more imperiled, but I think that can be done. I think what's harder is when people are masterfully good at reframing the world in ways that are empirically true, but just like shockingly bad ideas that we're a little more vulnerable to. So, who can fix that?
Joe, you can fix that.
Oh, I fix that every day, for sure. No, it's very tough, and the notion that we're the opposition party, but he needs us and he plays us. We have to keep that in mind too. We're not the opposition party. We're part of this. We're dealing with it every day. We're making coverage decisions. We're making personal decisions about how nice to be. How some of those people, in the film, whether to burn him or whether to not burn him, but tell the truth and then worry that you're not going to get asked back, but as I guess we're learning, he's going to ask you back anyway. So apparently it's maybe not that hard. But yeah, it's interesting that he is such a compelling figure, but we don't entirely know what he believes. This notion of populism and, we should worry about the white working class and even the black working class. He'll do that.
Hispanics.
Hispanics as well. The ones who are here legally. He really has a good way of pretending it's not racist, but then he, if you push him, he gets there. So I don't know. I'm now rambling.
Well, but that's exactly the kind of vulnerability I'm talking about. Where if you don't say, "Hello, I'm a white nationalist. Nice to meet you," it's like hard to nail them on that.
Right, and very few of them want to say that. Although more and more they are. So
I talked to some who do, but it's
that's a good thing.
I think also, the sort of project name of this film, although we never really thought it was going to be the title of the film, that came to me from that first meeting where Marie-Therese and I, talked to him in September 2017. I was like, let's call it Looking Glass, because I felt like I was through the looking glass, and it's not about everything. Sometimes it was like, I think that fact is wrong, but also a lot of times it was just like, we're talking about the same phenomenon in society, but we just see this, the reasons or the solution entirely differently. And constantly throughout this film, I really felt like I was being embedded in. I grew to understand that there's a whole worldview. Like, this is not just like it's not specific ideas. That there's a whole worldview that kind of comes with, the people in the photo lines and the, leaders of the nationalist parties abroad. Like, there really was. You could start to see certain hallmarks of a shared worldview. And so I don't know, I think your question's really good, and part of it is, I think, but again, I'm a documentary filmmaker, but I think, I'm okay saying I'm a person with a worldview too, and it's not always about catching someone and, your stats are wrong, because it's about interpretation. And I think, being able to talk about that honestly, and, again, I think the film is fair and truthful and accurate, and it was made by someone who has a worldview and that influenced all the choices I made and what we put in, where I chose to put the camera, and I think maybe just talking about that more and owning it in the same way. I do feel like this worldview in the film, the people who have it, they don't mind saying, I have a worldview, and I think that's, I have a worldview too.
Yeah. There's a concept in the New Yorker fact-checking process called on author, where they can put a fact on author. It's not in your notes, it's just something you believe. And I wrote a very short piece about Tucker Carlson yesterday, where I said some tortured phrase called he seems to sometimes echo white nationalist talking points. And they were like, could we just say he echoes white nationalism.
You can.
And I was like, yes, exactly. So I was like, well, he denies it, but if we put it on author as my observation of the world, I know what white nationalists sound like. I know what he sounds like. Right. But that's that's a tricky thing. It's you're always walking a tightrope where what if he sues me for defamation? What if like that? It's not an easy.
Can I add something? Because I think it's something that gets forgotten, and unfortunately we weren't able to really capture it that much in the film, but I think it's important to kind of note that Bannon really isn't fringe. I mean, he is the Republican Party. He is on the phone. We saw him, both of us, on the phone and heard him on the phone with Republican leadership, senators.
Luckily, he has a really big font size, so.
No, but I heard him on the phone. It's like I heard the other person on the phone. I think it's just important to remember this isn't. We call people white nationalists, we call them far right, but it's the Republican Party, and it is, and I think that it's important to know that he's not just operating over there. I mean, there's a reason his office is right by Capitol Hill. He's talking to powerful people, not just in politics, but you see Ronald Lauder. I mean, I'm just going to say, he's talking to very powerful philanthropists. He's talking to, this is not, I think when we think of white nationalism, when we think of far right, we are thinking of, people we're thinking of David Duke, we're thinking of, these alt-right guys, Richard Spencer, but actually the Republican Party, he is the Republican Party. I don't really think there's any view that he holds that is really too far to the right of the Republican Party in 2019. And I do think that's important to remember, everybody.
And that he's not separate from the elites either. I mean, the private planes.
Oh my God. I mean, Eric Prince. I mean, Mr. Populism, man of the people, and then there's Eric Prince. It's just hypocrisy.
Was the only person who had the good sense to not say something in front of the camera. All right, so let's do our 3 questions. Where's the, over there.
Oh, hi, it was a great film, Alison. I hate to ask this question because as an author and also a book critic, the most horrible thing is to read or hear somebody say, why didn't you include this in your book? Which is usually, a code for you should have written a different book. But I'm curious about why didn't you have the Oxford Union speech that Bannon gave in there? That was in your timeline, right?
I think that was after the midterms, and if not, it might have been because he just flew in just for that and then came back and it was sort of a resources type of question. But I kind of think, because I watched it, but it might have been just
right afterwards.
Because
I think he even told me you should have been
in December.
Yeah, I think he was like, you should have been here, and I was like, we're not filming anymore.
Yeah, the last
The other thing
took
is
the microphone off, the night of the midterm.
You did have a cutaway from his bookshelf or his nightstand, and I didn't see Baron Ebola, any of the books that Baron Ebola, the Italian fascist. There was a story at one point in the Times during the campaign where they said, wow, Bannon's got Ebola on this bookshelf. It's like Hitler. And you know what? It takes about 30 seconds to actually Google that guy and say, wow, how would he even let that story get out?
What's the book?
He does read Ebola.
Is that, I'm sorry.
Yeah, he does read Ebola because it's in the Josh Green book. And
Maybe it just wasn't on his.
Well, there's thousands. There's a whole other room that's full of books.
Yeah, and Dugan.
But I mean, that's really pretty toxic stuff.
It is.
Yeah. No, I mean
He reads all that stuff. Can we do in the back? Yeah.
Oh yeah, hi. Hey. First of all, thank you. The film was really riveting. Alison, I'm curious. First of all, I want to commend you because we spend so much time, especially over the last couple of years, condemning the media in general and the press for spending a lot of time trying to understand Trump voters. And I think you did a great job, not trying to understand them, but just to portray them as they were. So having been through all those events and all those different kinds of speeches, like small rooms, big rooms, I'm wondering what, in your view, do you think is holding those people together and how that differs or is the same in the way he sees it?
In truth, my vantage point is probably closer to how he sees it, since I was kind of at his side, and I didn't then go off with the crowd and, you know, spend a night with someone random. Like, I really was pretty close to his world, although then again, you know, as people were around him. I mean, I think, like, the question that I ask in the middle of the film about identity politics, you know, that was one thing. It was really hard for me to bite my tongue on because I feel like he's always disparaging the left as being about identity politics, and it just drives me nuts because I mean, I didn't specifically think this until I observed it, but I was like, that is 100% what is happening here. There is Billy Bush weekends, you know, reminded the Bezos Washington Post, you know, like there was all this terminology. It was like, you know, that at least in the US, I would say, you know, that they kind of, he would use as a shorthand, and it's because they all, you know, in the people in the room, it either could infer what it was, but clearly the Facebook memes that they saw, you know, the radio that they listened to, you know, if they read Breitbart, you know, whatever it was, it didn't even have to just be authored by him, but there was like a shared, again, this worldview. And, you know, for me, I looked at it, I thought it was about distrusting the media, but of course not the media they were consuming, just, you know, everything else. There was, I thought, a lot of misogyny baked into it. I thought there was a lot of, I mean, and he talks about it, the evangelical Christian kind of worldview, but it's not, you know, it is a coalition.
Also whiteness.
Yeah, I mean,
whiteness was there.
Yeah, and I think that increasingly you could see what he was trying to change, or in terms of the language, and I think he was trying to make it not sound as white, you know, like
Right.
that's why he would throw in all the time, you know, blacks and Hispanics, like, and I like, again, there's, just look at who is funding him, look at what his agenda is, and I think it doesn't matter, he could say that every day, you know, and again, worldview. I personally don't believe that the problems that he might identify that can be true in terms of, you know, economic issues in this country, let's say, I just think there are quicker ways to remedy them than saying we're going to change immigration and build a wall. Again, worldview, I don't think, and I would ask him about, you know, what about minimum wage, what about, you know, CEO pay, anything, you know, and the answer is in the end, you push and push, and he either has very standard Republican or like neocon kind of ideas, or you get to the point where he says, listen, it's early days, we're still figuring it out, you know, we got to catch up, we got to have the policies. So anyway, yeah, I think that, and then when going abroad with him, then I started to pick up on more this idea of birth rates and the West, the Judeo-Christian West. And that, I think, points even more, and I did actually, you know, I would talk to Andrew because we are friends, and he is an expert more in
Steeped in this
role,
stuff, yeah.
and I said, well, you know, actually, I was like, I showed him some dailies of some of these things. I said, does this mean something more to some people? And basically, and he was like, yes. And, you know, I kind of educated myself. But again, it's all there in the mix. So, you know, it is this kind of cocktail of all these things, but it's a whole worldview.
Yeah, and part of it was listening for dog whistles, which just takes, you know, whatever, you know, like learning some words, and once you hear them, you just hear them every time, and context and, you know, references. But also, in addition, we would have conversations of like, if that isn't based on a white supremacist assumption, then what else is a plausible explanation for that? Like, if you know, and it's not just Bannon, there's a lot of parts to, you know, any kind of sort of like neo-populist movement, whatever you want to call it. If there's another plausible explanation, let's think of it, but sometimes there just isn't one.
We have our last question right over here.
Yeah.
This is a question for Joan, Paul, and Andrew. In the 2016 elections, all the hate rallies and kind of the hate-mongering events that Trump generated, which could become violent or unpredictable or dramatic and sensational, drove up ratings in even the mainstream media outlets, and provided a tremendous platform for Trump as a candidate because he was getting a lot of attention. As journalists, how do you advise striking that balance going forward where what's happening is given visibility, but is somehow in a different context that allows all sides to be heard?
Well, I think it's a really, really good question, and it's another difficult question to answer. I mean, I don't think it's just incumbent on journalists. I think it's all of us. It's an ecosystem. And American politics, you know, I was here in the 2016 election, covered it. It was obviously riveting. It's the most amazing political show on earth. But in some ways, you know, you start to feel like it becomes devoid of meaning. And I'm seeing this now with the 2020 Democratic race. You know, it's all about the strategy, you know, who's going to be whose vice presidential candidate. You know, if you have a black woman, maybe we've got Joe Biden because he's an older man. At what point does it become about the policy? You know, and I sometimes feel that the way in which politics unravels in this country is part of why Trump became president.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't know how you untangle yourself from that. You know, Bannon really understood it. He talks about economic nationalism. He says it's about jobs. Watch what he does. He doesn't do economic nationalism. He does culture. He's appealing to immigration, and it's not immigrants that people are concerned of. It's dark-skinned people. It's people of different cultures. And I just think sort of Bannon understands that. Trump understands that. And when you've got this, you know, incredibly toxic mix of, you know, the cultural pull of this kind of powerful politics, and all of us sort of locked into this system where we are, you know, obsessed with every sort of cough and spit of this as though it's baseball, as though it wasn't politics. I think that's really dangerous, and I don't know how you change it.
I don't know how you change it. You know, small progress. It seems like the big networks are not going to his rallies right away. They're not covering his rallies. I really do remember in 2015 and 16 actually getting bumped from TV hits because they just were covering, waiting for him to get off the plane and stuff like that. That, you know, they're being more selective. But Paul's right. You know, it is partly on us. There are a lot of policies out there being debated. There's a big debate about Medicare for all. These, you know, I'm covering the 2020 campaign. These people have good ideas and maybe not so good ideas, but, you know, it's hard to break through with coverage of their ideas. So, you know, I am blessed to work for the nation because I can, but a lot of folks aren't as blessed and have to work harder to get the freedom to do that, but we have to be demanding more. I will say I found myself very optimistic at the end of the film just because we need to be reminded about what happened in November. Like, oh my God, like he kind of called it like 40 seats. And those people, especially those young women, are changing everything. They're not changing the media fast enough. The media is still trying to cover them as, you know,
It's really true.
Hellcats, and they're fighting with Pelosi and meow. But really, things are very different in Washington, and pay attention to that. That's really exciting.
Yeah, I agree with all that. The only thing I would add about the specific journalism piece of it, or the business of journalism, is that the business model of journalism matters a lot, and it's really unsexy and unfun to think about because it is not doing well, and there's no guarantee that it will not decline further. But journalism is weird because it is a kind of double bottom line business, even though it doesn't always accept that fact or advertise that fact. It talks about itself as, you know, there's a moment in the movie where Bannon talks about, you know, the spread of ideas through the marketplace of ideas is like the spread of capital through the financial markets. That's actually not true. The financial markets don't care about anything except money and not getting caught if they break the law. That's not supposed to be true of journalism and ideas and publishing and all the rest of it. And I think journalists would do well to reacquaint themselves and be more comfortable talking about that, because it makes no sense. If you just want to make money, you could just put the Kardashians on the front page of the New York Times every day. That's not, it's a mission-driven institution. So I think we can get more comfortable with that. And it doesn't determine everything. I mean, it's still a case-by-case difficult decision. So it's not a preordained answer, but it's a better way of asking the question, I think.
Like which Kardashian?
Yeah.
You know?
Some of them are actually generous, so yeah. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. This has been great.